Hi everyone. Welcome to my first online lecture. We're going to talk today about elaboration likelihood model. If you recall, all the way before spring break, that week before break, I had you do a reading on it. So we're going to talk about it today. I'll have some examples along the way. Tomorrow you will actually do an application activity with it. We'll do one more theory on Wednesday, an application activity with that on Thursday, and then we'll go into a couple of kind of more self-guided units before we get into our final project, and I'll talk about all of that along the way. I'm recording this on Wednesday, March 18th, so this is the day after the Illinois primary. I hope those of you that are 18 were able to get out to the polls yesterday. Turnout was down in Illinois. It was about 55% of the level it was at in 2016, at least on the Democratic side. The Republican side, it's hard to tell as much because when there's an incumbent party, that can kind of lower turnout naturally, in addition to the coronavirus um, concerns. Um, so some news that came out of yesterday is that Joe Biden, the former vice president, swept all three states that voted yesterday in Illinois, Florida, and Arizona. Ohio was also supposed to vote yesterday, but they've postponed their presidential primary to June 2nd. So Biden's looking to have a pretty firm lead. There's still no indication that Bernie Sanders is going to drop out of the race. And President Trump has officially gotten enough delegates to re-win his party's nomination. From a rhetorical standpoint, though, as you look over the next few weeks, it will be interesting to see how the COVID-19 pandemic has really will affect the eventual election. We're seeing, first of all, a huge economic downturn. I mean, the Dow Jones has contracted, and the S&P 500 have contracted to eliminate the entire stock market gains since President Trump has taken office. There's also been a mixed messaging coming out of the administration about the severity, the potential severity of COVID-19. And you have what's looking like the nominee in Vice President Biden, who oversaw some responses, some successful responses during the Obama administration to responding to the COVID-19, to other pandemics and other epidemics. So it will be interesting to see how rhetorically that starts to pan out. So I would say start looking for some campaign ads that engage that. Um, of course, this is all assuming that the conventions will happen as normal over the summer and stuff like that. So that's just kind of the top of what I wanted to talk about. So let's start talking about elaboration likelihood model. So elaboration likelihood model was developed in the early 1980s by Petty and Chapio. And what they were doing is they actually looked at cognition, and we talked about cognition with cognitive dissonance theory. Cognition being knowledge and how we use knowledge and how we process knowledge. And so the overarching part of this theory essentially is the idea that we need to know how attitudes are formed and changed, and that's going to happen based on how much cognitive processing in our brain we put behind it. So, first of all, what is elaboration likelihood model? Elaboration likelihood model argues that cognitive persuasion occurs in two different routes. There's first the central route, which requires careful thought and consideration and motivation. And then there's the peripheral route, which means that messages kind of wash over us and we respond with some type of basic cue or basic response. So the real difference here is the level of thought and careful planning that goes into how we respond to a given message. So for example, with the central route, we're going to have a pretty high level of motivation to want to process something centrally, to sorry, to process something centrally. And we're going to need to have some motivation behind wanting to process that. So, in other words, if a commercial comes on our television, right, if we're watching Hulu while we're all locked inside for a while, and a commercial comes on because we haven't paid for the ad-free version, we may just let that go, right? We may not be focused on that because we're more focused on the actual television show, or we're doing something else, or we're checking our phones or whatever. And so that might be, there are these, let's say in one ad break, 6 or 7 advertisements, we're probably going to process those more peripherally. However, if something comes on and it's for a product that you like or a product you particularly don't like, you may start to process that centrally, right? And you may start to take a little more consideration to it. And that's really, one of the things that we've talked about in this class or done in this class is take a little closer look at some advertisements. And so as a result of taking a closer look at some of those advertisements, you may find yourself being more motivated, at least right now, to process messages more centrally. Um, I think along with, right now more people are probably centrally processing since we're a little more motivated to process things like messages about COVID-19, messages either from Governor Pritzker, maybe announcing another closing of some sort, another quarantine-esque response. Whereas maybe if you see something else more politically charged, you might be like, well, I'm normally involved, like interested in politics, but right now COVID-19 has kind of taken over everything, so I'm going to process most things peripherally. And so we don't have the time and energy and effort to process everything centrally. We actually spend most of our time in that peripheral route. And so, as a message maker, you need to be aware of how are you going to let this play out? What do you want your audience and how do you want your audience to process your message? You actually may want them to only process it peripherally for a really long time and then activate that and shift that into the central route when they need something from you. And I'll explain that in a little more detail later on. Um, so, that's kind of what we have going on here. So we have the central route and we have the peripheral route. This also in the text also talks about this whole idea about need for cognition. The need for cognition essentially is the degree to which we enjoy cognition, to which we enjoy thinking. And we're all different, right? So this idea and this was Petty and Chippo, they are articulated this idea of need for cognition as well, as saying that we're all different, that some people don't want to think about things as much as others, right? Some of us may be a little more skeptical naturally, and those of us that are more skeptical naturally will want to think about almost everything. Whereas if we're not as skeptical naturally, eh, maybe we don't want to think about things as much. And also ego involvement, like who we are at the core of our person is involved in this and is essential because personally, and I think you all probably have gathered this, looking at the political landscape, politics, and how it works is something that I'm really motivated by. I'm not all that motivated by celebrity news. And so every once in a while, I'll see some celebrity news break because it'll pop up somewhere, and I'll text my wife about it because I know that she's a little more into celebrity news than I am. And usually she'll go, yeah, I saw that 2 days ago. And I'll go, well, I tried. Um, you know, the same thing can be said, she's much more ego involved with things that are related to physical therapy. I've really found that I enjoy podcasts, but the type of podcasts I enjoy are very different from the type of podcasts she enjoys just because we're approaching them from two different egos, two different ego levels of ego involvement, and we're different. We want to think about different things. And so this need for it doesn't mean that you're less intelligent or less smart or anything like that if you don't have a high need for cognition. It just means you think about things a little bit differently. And that's really okay. Um, and then so in order to really understand this, um, let's shift over to there's a Word document that is you should see below the video in Blackboard. And I'm going to add some notes to that, and I would encourage you to fill this out as well because you're going to need to know this as you do the activity. You're going to need to know kind of this whole thought process as you go through the activity tomorrow. So I'm going to pull up my version here. So, and I'll try to make my font a little bit bigger. Feel free at any point also to pause the video, replay parts of the video for this and any of the lectures that I give. So we're gonna kind of go through this and we're gonna think about how we might process a message. And so I'll throw some different examples out there as we go along. So the first thing here is we're gonna put this all this is based around persuasive communication. And let's define persuasive communication as any message intended to shape, reinforce, or change the responses of another or others. Any message intended to shape, reinforce, or change the responses of another or others. In oral comm, I talk about persuasion and persuasive communication being about changing an attempt to shift the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. And I think these really work together, right? So it's any message. It doesn't have to be a successful message to be persuasion. It's a message that's being sent out. And it's any message intended to shape, reinforce, or change the responses of another individual. And those responses might be how we act, they might be how we think, they might be what we believe in and what we value. And remember, it's not just one person, it can be a bunch of different people, and all of that is okay. So that's persuasive communication. So the first question, as we think about elaboration likelihood model and trying to figure out which route we are processing everything through, that's the first thing that we have to ask ourselves is persuasion occurring? Are we being attempted to be persuaded? If it's not persuasive, it's just literally informative information, we stop, we can't go through elaboration likelihood model. If it is, though, then we come down to the next box. And in this next box, we have to ask ourselves this question about the information. Are we motivated to process the information? Are we motivated to process the information? And along with that, we need to ask, is there personal relevance or ego involvement? So it's not enough for us to simply know, are we motivated to process the information, because we might be motivated, but if we also aren't answering that second question of is there personal relevance or ego involvement, right? So maybe we're motivated to process it, but once we start processing it, we realize that there's not a lot in this message for us. That can change our answer. So you really have to answer yes to both questions to continue to go down this chart. Um, I'll do this to give us a little more space here on what you can see. So instead of going down, let's first start. We're going to answer no first, okay? So maybe think of as an 18-year-old who, you're not in the market to buy a new car right now. You see a car commercial come on. Well, I'm not in the market for a new car right now. You have your parents' car, you're about to go to college, and you're gonna have to rely on public transit and your parents to come and get you because, they're taking your car back or whatever it might be, or maybe they're letting you take your car to college. Whatever that might be, well, I'm not in the market for a new or a used car right now, so I'm gonna say no, and I'm gonna come down here to this box. And so here, you need to ask yourself, are there peripheral cues present? And along with that, we're asking if there are peripheral cues, and I'll clarify that here in a second. Are there positive or negative effects? Are there positive or are there sources that are coming along with this? And are there a number of arguments? So a peripheral cue can really be a bunch of different things. That doesn't have to just be one single thing. Um, Maybe it's a specific, there's a specific jingle, right? Or there's a specific slogan, right? So Nike's Just Do It campaign. Going way back, Tony the Tiger for Frosted Flakes, Frosted Flakes, they're more than good, they're great, because it was a tiger grating, right? So those can be peripheral cues. And then based on those peripheral cues, though, we can get a positive or a negative effect. Sometimes a logo, right, can be a peripheral cue. We see a logo come up and we go, I don't like that. For example, I've always been a part of a family that drives Fords. I own a Ford. My wife owns a Ford. My parents, I mean, I think at one point between my parents, my aunt and uncle, my grandpa, my cousin that lives with my grandpa, and my wife and I, we could have had almost all of the at least basic Ford cars in one picture across several generations. So, when I see a commercial for something like Chevrolet or General Motors or Chrysler, I kind of disengage. I'm not really motivated by it. Um, I don't really pay attention to even what's being said in the commercial, and that can work. That can cut both ways. In terms of sources too, where's the source is kind of like where's the information coming from? Um, if it's coming, like, let's say there's a celebrity spokesperson, well, is there a positive or negative effect about that celebrity spokesperson to you, right? So maybe if Kim Kardashian is sponsoring something, well, that might impact one person differently than another person. It might be positive for one person and negative for another. And then a number of arguments. That whole idea is just, is there only one thing that's kind of cutting through, or are there a lot of different things cutting through? So while the first box over here, if we answered no to either question, we went here. If we're answering yes to any of these questions, we actually can go up. And if we're answering yes, then, and especially if there is some type of positive or negative effect as a result of the peripheral cue, then there is at least a peripheral attitude shift. So there at least should be some type of peripheral attitude shift. And then, sorry, this actually shouldn't say no. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. This should say if motivated. So then, if we get motivated from that peripheral attitude shift, then we can come back here and we start back here, okay? And then we go through this process again. If we're not motivated, we have a peripheral attitude shift. So maybe, so I'm not in the market to buy a car, but I see that LeBron James is sponsoring someone. I come up here I have an attitude shift to, okay, I view Chevrolet's a little more positively now, but that's all I'm going to do with the message. And that might happen. On the flip side here, let's say your answer to all these are no, right? We just get to the point where we're no, the answer is no. Then we're going to retain or regain. Let's say there was a temporary shift in this, retain or regain our initial attitude. So we're just going to go back to acting the exact same way we did before any of this started, if the answer here is no. And as you can see here, you're going to have a lot of ways where we can only go the peripheral route, where maybe we start in the central route and midway through the message something happens and we're like, no, you know what? This is going to be now processed peripherally, and that's the ball game. Okay, so let's come back over here. So let's assume either the answer to all these questions was yes, or maybe we went through this peripheral attitude shift, and so now we're going to we see the same commercial again, and so now we're going to say, I have personal relevance now. Maybe I see that car commercial. I've seen a bunch of different car commercials. And, LeBron James stands by Chevrolet and General Motors, so I'll give them a shot. And I know LeBron is, I think Lexus is who he's supported in the past, but that's neither here nor there. So let's say the answer to these questions up here is yes. We are motivated to process the information. There is personal relevance and or ego involvement. So now we have to ask ourselves, what is our ability to process the information? Are we distracted? Are we literate in the medium the message is being presented in? So in other words, it's not enough that we're motivated to process the message. We just have to then be able to actually process the message. So if we're distracted, right? So maybe a commercial comes on my ears perk up a little bit, but then I get a phone call or I get a text message or a Snapchat or whatever, and I decide to answer it because it's from someone I haven't heard from for a couple weeks. Well, okay, now I have to go back over here to peripheral, right? I go back into this peripheral route. I can't go forward. Um, maybe we're distracted in something else. Maybe I'm making dinner and the TV's on, and I start to get motivated to listen, and then the timer goes off, and I have to pull something out of the air fryer. I don't know. Any number of things can distract us here. Um, but we also have to make sure that we're literate in the medium that the message is being presented in. So we have to make sure um, that we understand what the message is and where the message is coming from. So this is where, maybe certain things about technology can come into play. I think of companies that advertise themselves very vaguely, like, UPS, we're all about logistics. Okay, so you're about shipping. No, we're about logistics. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, if I'm not someone that's in the business world, I may not know exactly what that means, and so I might not be motivated anymore to look into what that company is. Or if I see a company like, oh, that advertisement is pretty interesting. I think maybe I have a higher need for cognition, so I want to check out what that product's about. I go to their website, and their website doesn't really tell me anything. Then, well, it doesn't tell me anything. I'm not motivated anymore. So then we would go back over here to, are there peripheral cues, all of that? No, we'd go back here. Yes, there is an attitude shift. Well, let's say that we are able to process the information. We're not distracted. We're literate in the medium. We come down here. And so then we have to consider, what is the nature of our cognitive processing? And what I mean by that is the new information being processed as positive information, negative information, or neutral information? So if it's positive or negative and we're still in the central route here, then we're going to go on, we'll finish this out. But let's say it's neutral, right? We get this new information and we process it and we realize we don't really know how to feel about it. We're going to then shoot it into the peripheral route because we can't make a decision on it yet. In order for a central attitude change to occur, which is what this last box is a central attitude change, we have to have feelings about the topic one way or another. And so at the end of all of it, that's really what it comes down to. Okay. Do we have this central attitude change? If we have a positive or negative processing of a piece of information, then yeah, we will have a central attitude change. If we don't, though, we're just going to come back up here and go into this peripheral route. And maybe once we get another message on it, we could end up back over here, but maybe not. So let's walk through this really quickly, and I want to give you an example of actually a new type of product of some sort. So let's say, you all are about to go off to college in the fall, and let's say, there are persuasive messages, and I've used this example before, but let's look at it through elaboration likelihood model. Let's say that you have seen advertisements for grocery stores your whole life, but your family is a Hy-Vee family. But you're going to go to college outside of the Midwest where there aren't any Hy-Vees. Okay, so let's say for now, you're not motivated to process information about another grocery store like a Kroger, right? Let's say you're going to to go into Ohio where there are Kroger stores. Okay, well, so far we haven't been motivated to process, so we kind of go through this and we go to this peripheral route anytime a message shows up. But now you've moved to a new place. So now you are motivated to process the information. There's a lot of personal relevance that goes along with that. And so then, well, what's our ability? Am I distracted? Okay, well, if I'm trying to figure out where I'm going to go buy groceries for the first time, I may not be distracted. I might be pretty inclined. And so then, we go through this. Well, I've heard of Kroger before. I haven't heard of another grocery store that might be there. So then, we get to this idea of we have central attitude change. The whole point of message makers use this peripheral loop. The reason that products have continual advertisement and advertising and are willing to pay so much for an advertising budget for every single year is simply because they want you to go through this. They want you to go through this process. And they want you to always be in the peripheral. So as soon as one of their peripheral cues pop up, maybe it's their jingle, an advertisement, a spokesperson for that company, that then you'll think about that company and you'll start to process it centrally when it's time to make a shift in behavior. Now those shifts, can happen at different times for different reasons, but that's really one of the biggest shifts and biggest things that have to be considered. Same goes for cell phone companies, same goes for internet providers, same goes for almost anything that's out there. So, tomorrow you'll have an application activity, but one thing just to kind of wrap up today, um, I have a prompt below this Word document, or sorry, a link to a discussion board, and I want you to go to that discussion board, and all I want you to do is to write out a quick example of something that you've noticed that you definitely process centrally, a message you've processed centrally, and a message that you've noticed recently that maybe you've processed more peripherally. So I want you to do one post, and then I also want you to respond to someone else. Multiple people can respond to the same person. You can respond to multiple people if you want. Feel free to engage in a real conversation about that. So that's all that I have left for today. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to email me. Make sure you're emailing my ILSTU email. And of course, feel free to contact me if you have any questions.